Operation Cross Country is an effort that's gone on over the last week in 106 cities, involving almost 400 law enforcement agencies, designed to rescue children who have been sold into the sex trade. Over the last week, we have rescued 168 kids and given them the help they need, the support they need, the counseling they need to help them escape this nightmare. These are not faraway kids in faraway lands. These are our kids on our street corners, our truck stops, our motels, our casinos. These are America's children.
It remains a topic most people would like to avoid, one that we want to shake our heads at and say it couldn't happen here, not in America, and then try to shovel it off as something so rare and so foreign. If only we ignore it, maybe it will go away. How incredibly naive and foolish it would make anyone with that misguided way of thinking. Human trafficking and the sex trade has invaded every American city, and in some places is almost out of control and beyond the scope of even law enforcement to make a real dent. As we launch ourselves into discourses about domestic violence and child abuse of late, we must not forget these victims. Welcome to MidPoint. Director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, Lori Cohen joins us. Lori, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Lori, this caught my attention and our attention here when we started to look at it, and the human trafficking instances, specifically even in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a place you would think is just about as all-American and as untouchable as possible. I looked at some of the data coming in from there, a special study they did there, talking about average age of victims, 15 to 16, average age actually 13. And here's a 259% increase in calls to the National Human Trafficking Resource Center between 2008 and 2012. Why is it growing so wildly? What's happened?
Well, I think there are a number of things that are happening. The sex trade is growing because it's being facilitated by the internet. The explosion of information technology is wonderful for sharing information, but it's also a very effective medium for promoting and exploiting the sale of children, and in many cases adults, for commercial sex.
Wait a minute, say that again, because we talked about kids, but I think we have to point out too that we're talking about adults as well who are human trafficked. Who mostly is in that group?
Well, we see both. We see children, and as Operation Cross Country indicated, there is a shockingly high incidence of children being sold for commercial sex. But let's not forget that when that 17-year-old child turns 18 and is now considered adult, that does not undermine the fact that that person is still being sold for sex against her, and in some cases against his will.
We're talking about prostitution in many ways, but are we also not talking about an instance that in many ways has roots in Europe, overseas, because there are still so many kids and adults in these places, in these instances, that are being kidnapped, that are being still sold basically as nothing more than flesh on an overseas market?
That's correct. There are estimates that as many as 27 million people are being trafficked in the human trafficking market across the globe. And there have been estimates that anywhere from approximately 15,000 to 18,000 people are trafficked from abroad into the United States annually. However, at the same time, there are other estimates that say as many as 10 times the number of U.S. citizens are being trafficked, U.S. citizen children are being trafficked in the United States. So it is a global phenomenon, but it is also very much a domestic phenomenon and a homegrown problem that we really need to be looking at.
When you talk about 27 million people being trafficked, is that yearly, total? What kind of number is that?
That estimate is an annual estimate. And
annual, every year?
Yes, 27 million annually are being trafficked. So at any given point in time, we will be seeing 27 million being sold either into the commercial sex trade or being sold as labor trafficking victims.
What can we, I'm astounded by the numbers here, and I'm sure so many other people are. What is it that we're not doing? If we're talking about 27 million people changing hands and being sold every single year. As I said, we're talking about things that need to be talked about: domestic abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse. Why is this not a front page issue?
Well, I think it is becoming a front page issue. President Obama made it a major policy point 2 years ago at the Clinton Global Initiative, and he repeated the administration's commitment to fighting trafficking on the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. The point that was raised at that time was that, even though slavery was declared to be ended in this country, it is sadly really thriving in a way that is hidden, that is secretive, and that, as you mentioned earlier, that people really don't want to discuss. Nobody really wants to look.
Is that maybe a point, or you just used a word? Do we need to stop calling this human trafficking and start calling it slavery? And maybe people would wake up a little bit more if we just used that simple word?
I mean, human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery, and we do have a number of organizations that they call themselves modern-day abolitionists. So here in New York, there is a very strong campaign by the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition that celebrates New York's modern-day abolitionists. And I think we can all come together around reinvigorating the abolitionist movement and really looking at what is happening to our children in terms of being sold for sex, and in some cases children and adults being sold for labor. It's slavery.
I only have about 30 seconds left. You mentioned the internet at the beginning of this interview. We don't always want to just put it on one thing, but isn't it fair to say that the internet is one of the biggest explosive points of this human slavery?
Absolutely. And I would say it's not merely the internet, but I would say what's driving the internet, what's driving the desire of pimps to post these children on the internet, it's demand. And so I think as we're looking at this issue, we really need to look at who is purchasing these children, who is purchasing these young slaves, and say there must be a focus on the buyer. And as much as we like to talk about helping children, as much as we want to talk about going after the pimps, there needs to be more accountability for the individuals purchasing sex. Those individuals need to be investigated, prosecuted, and brought to justice.
Well
it
put. We're all out of time. Laurie Cohen, thank you so much for the frank comments, and MidPoint will continue.